Okay, let's talk about ISO and what it's all about. So, the first thing you need to know about ISO is that it's all about how sensitive your camera is to the light. Now, I don't want to make this a super technical discussion. I want to make this a discussion that you can actually use and apply to your photography. So, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty details, but if you just keep that basic thought in mind, that ISO is all about how sensitive your camera is to the light. And you can adjust by adjusting your ISO, you adjust how sensitive your camera is to the light. And you can help it to see properly in bright light, and you can help it to see properly in the dark. Now, you're already familiar with this because of your eyes. You've probably experienced being outdoors in bright light and then coming indoors and it feels really, really dark, like darker than it should be. But after a couple of minutes, your eyes adjust to the light and everything's fine. Well, there you go. There's your eyes adjusting to the light. I bet you've had this happen as well, where you've woken up in the middle of the night or something. You wake up in the dark, but somebody suddenly turns a light on and it almost burns your eyes out. Like you can't even get your eyes open. They're so sensitive to the light. Well, if you set your ISO wrong and you go out into super bright light and your camera is super sensitive to the light, you're not going to ruin your camera, but you're just going to totally burn out the photo, and it's going to be way overexposed and not look properly. And of course, if you have your ISO set for bright light and then you go into dim light, well, then your camera's not going to be able to see properly in the light, and it's going to run into all kinds of problems, dark photos, blurry photos, things like that. So just remember, ISO is all about how you can adjust your camera to be properly sensitive to the light. Now, ISO is a starting point because there is also aperture and shutter speed which deals with light in their own unique way. But ISO is really the starting point. It's your way of telling the camera whether it's in bright light or dim light so that it can basically act properly and see properly. And remember, of course, that photographs are actually made out of light. I know it's a digital process, and way back in the day, it was a chemical process with film, but light is the essential ingredient, whether you're dealing with chemicals or whether you're dealing with a digital process. It's all about light. So it's critical that we deal properly with the light. Now, when you are out in bright sun, you should set your ISO somewhere between 100 and 400. And this means your camera is not going to be oversensitive to the light. It's just going to be properly, normally sensitive for bright sunlight. Now, I often tell people that 100 or 200 is the best starting point, but I have found lately that especially if people start closing their aperture, they really need to be in a little bit higher ISO out even in bright sun. So 400 is really what I'm going to recommend for you, especially if you are in aperture mode and you're closing your aperture at all, or you're hoping for a quick shutter speed to freeze the action, because you're photographing a sports game or something like that. So my recommendation is ISO 400. Then if you're in the shade or in overcast or cloudy light, then ISO, actually that should be ISO 800 to 1600. ISO 400 is actually probably not going to cut it. Your camera is not going to be sensitive enough to the deep shade or the dim overcast light. So more like 800 or 1600. And I would almost recommend, if you're just staying in the shade or staying in overcast light, you almost want to be right up at 1600. When you move indoors, now indoors is going to vary. Are you in a room that has floor-to-ceiling windows, wall to wall, or are you in a room with nothing but one dim little light bulb on? Well, those are two very different lighting scenarios. But just general indoor purpose, 3200 to 6400 is usually good. Now, I have a really nice bright living room. This is not my living room here in this picture, but when I photograph my kids in my living room, I usually don't need to be on 3200, more like 800 or 1600, but it's a very bright living room. when the sun sets and things go dim and the lamps go on, then I'm photographing at ISO 6400. And again, it's allowing your camera to basically see in the dark or see in dim light. And it's going to help your photo to be a lot better. Now, here's a problem. The higher you go with the ISO, the more grain you're going to start to see in your photo. So you see all these discolored speckles here. This is because of a high ISO. Now, this is a photograph I took with a fairly old camera. The newer the camera, the less grain or noise actually is what it's called in digital photography, the less noise that you're going to see. So newer camera is better. And with an old camera, you might not be able to go beyond ISO 800 before you start to see a lot of noise. But with a brand new camera, I can put it on ISO 6400 and hardly see any noise. It's not going to look like this at all. So just keep that in mind, that when you raise your ISO a lot higher for those low light situations, you are going to see a lot of grain. Okay, so remember the key point here is that ISO is all about how sensitive your camera is to the light. If you're in bright light, you need to set your camera for bright light. That's going to help it to see without burning your camera's eyes out. And if you're in dim light, you need to help your camera to be more sensitive to that dim light. So you need to raise your ISO up a lot higher. Remember, you're going to run into some issues with grain, but for the most part, a higher ISO is, yes, it's going to let your camera see better in the dark, but it's also going to help you get more crisp photos because it will help you with a higher shutter speed. If you're doing a lot of low light or dim light photography, also check out my video about aperture for dim light.